These days, try to find some politician talking about education without talking about the economic value that it creates. Here, for instance, is North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper's campaign website, where he says, "Our state's economic future depends on the quality of its workforce and how we cannot afford to fall behind other states in education." He's a Democrat, but if we look at, say, Ed Gillespie, who's running for governor of Virginia as a Republican, his website touts the value of education for career readiness and finding good-paying jobs. When it comes to building public support for education, apparently, to rip off the Wu-Tang Clan, cash rules everything around us. But that has not always been the case. In this video, we're going back to the early 1980s to try to understand how this connection of education and economic growth became such a big thing. This was not coincidentally also when governors really started trying to own education as an issue. Before 1980, you had very few education governors who really tried to make their name by improving their state's educational system. But during the 1980s, you were hard-pressed to find governors who weren't trying to be education governors. Two such men, Bill Clinton of Arkansas and George W. Bush of Texas, went on to the White House, while several others became secretaries of education. Why did all these governors suddenly become education governors? And why did they virtually all talk in this language of education for economic growth? Now, before this, in the 1960s and 1970s, the conversation around schools wasn't about economic development. It was about equality of access. It was about civil rights and desegregation, about busing and neighborhood schools, about special education and bilingual education. There was some talk of accountability and testing, but this wasn't discussed as important to grow the economy, but instead to make sure that taxpayers were getting a good bang for their buck. Now, take for example Jim Hunt, governor of North Carolina, starting in 1977. He'll go on to be one of the biggest talkers of the vitality of educational excellence for economic growth. But in 1977, when he starts out, he talks to the General Assembly about education, and instead he talks about rights granted by the North Carolina Constitution. Or he talks about how nothing is more central to our future. Our children are our future. Or he talked about how the schools belong to the people. Schools were important, education was necessary, but not because jobs were important, because people were important. Now that changes quickly in the 1980s. Hunt starts courting new industries to North Carolina, like microelectronics and biotechnology. And suddenly he starts talking about how good schools are necessary for good jobs. In the fall of 1982, Hunt chairs the Education Commission of the States, an interstate compact that swaps ideas about education. And there he establishes a national task force on education for economic growth. From that point on, this education for economic growth mantra becomes central to North Carolina's economic development strategy. It became a new staple of this new economy narrative that overran state politics from then until now. And it started spilling out to other states. Over in Mississippi, where Governor William Winter hammered the point about the economic returns from investment in education in order to win approval of the biggest increase in education spending the state had ever seen. There were similar stories in Tennessee, and Arkansas, South Carolina, California, New Jersey, and so on. So how can we account for this explosion of education governors emphasizing the economic returns of education in the 1980s? One reason was that the economy had been in the tank in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And so everyone was pitching everything as something that could heal stagflation, get the economy back on track. Education, unlike other aspects of economic policy like trade or federal interest rates, was something that governors could do something about. Now, two, state leaders were trying to fill a void that was left by the federal government. Ronald Reagan was in his first term as president, and his administration, particularly his budget director, was trying to hack federal spending down considerably. While the cuts weren't as draconian as initially proposed, and the lion's share of ed funding has always come from state and local funds, the Reagan cuts were sizable. In 1980, the federal government supplied 9.2% of the K-12 funding in the United States. By 1984, that was down to 6.4%. That might not sound like a lot, but the cuts had outsized impacts on the poorest schools, which got more money from the federal government. Many school systems faced tough choices about cutting food and transportation, raising class sizes, or reducing administrative support. Governors got to play savior for these school systems that were really hurting. Now, by framing education as an economic issue, governors could cut through the racial divisions heightened by the desegregation process. Busing controversies were just starting to die down, and the political parties, especially the Democrats, were trying to build new biracial coalitions. In the South especially, Democrats wanted to hold on to businessmen, but they also wanted to keep their sometimes unwieldy coalition of African Americans, rural whites, public employees, and urban progressives. The education for economic growth language was appealing because it helped them argue that everyone, meaning blacks as well as whites, the poor as well as the well-heeled, needed a better education without emphasizing historical inequalities or social justice imperatives. In this period, it was useful for governors to talk around race and speak instead about jobs. Finally, a reason why so many of these governors did this, they actually believed it. They were often informed by their own personal experience, using schooling as a way to up and out of the working class grind. Hunt in North Carolina worked his way up from an eastern North Carolina farm to law school thanks to public access to education and his parents' encouragement. Bill Clinton rose up from Hope, Arkansas to become a Rhodes Scholar thanks to education. And in addition to that personal experience, these governors had an array of policy advisors who helped convince them that better schools would produce better jobs. And even if developing that virtuous cycle would take time, that it was a necessary investment given the offshoring of low-skill factory work and the increasingly advanced technology of the factories that remained. This emphasis on education for economic growth swept the nation and became an irresistible part of the dialogue on education reform. It was key rhetoric in a bunch of reports that were released in the early 1980s that called for education reform. Now, the most famous of these was A Nation at Risk, put out after 18 months of study by a blue-ribbon National Commission on Excellence in Education. And it ominously warned that, quote, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. To make America great again required strong schools in order to compete against the Japanese and South Koreans and Germans who were flooding U.S. markets with superior goods. You could also find economic rationales for better schools in other reports released in 1983, from Governor Jim Hunt's Task Force on Education for Economic Growth, or from the Southern Regional Education Board's report, Meeting the Need for Quality, and also a slew of other reports released in that era. All told, these reports shifted attention away from Reagan's priority on cutting federal support for schools and towards the emphasis of the education governors on improving schools in order to compete in this globalizing economy. It invigorated both federal and state interest in education policy, for better or worse, and the idea that education was crucial for the post-industrial future of America certainly helped in terms of quieting those calling for drastic cuts to school budgets. In the short term of the 1980s, the education for economic growth pitch was remarkably successful in uniting a political coalition to achieve some of the most broad-reaching educational packages in state history. In the longer term, it helped catalyze a national trend towards valuing education and economic returns, circumscribing the rationales for public schooling in ways ultimately detrimental to the cause of educational equity. After all, how can we pinpoint the economic returns of schooling? How can we value the impact of schooling on creating better citizens or making for a more cohesive society? The economic emphasis, the workforce development goals, can drown out a lot of other really important reasons that we should want to have good public schools. The emphasis on education for economic growth also put a lot of pressure on school systems. During the 1980s, policymakers in both state and federal branches started looking for ways to measure the quality of the school system, and as often as not, that was through testing that became increasingly high stakes. The accountability systems that emerged did a good job of marking poor performing schools, but at least so far they've been far less successful at actually reforming them so that everyone gets a quality education.